1 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. 1, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And 2, how important is that objective?
Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I'm going to do the PoetryTube Newbie Tag. This was created by Adrian at Strip Cover Lit. And I was tagged to do this by Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics. So, as you can tell from the clip I just showed, perhaps you picked up on the idea that poetry has really not ever been my thing. That I've read a lot less poetry and found poetry a lot more difficult than prose, than just straight fiction. And so I'm really uncomfortable about doing this tag, but I've kind of made a determination this year to try to read more poetry. It's not that I never read poetry at all. I do have poetry collections from Dylan Thomas and Seamus Heaney, Octavio Paz, Rilke. I have the Oxford Anthology of English Poetry, the 2-volume set. You know, I have a huge book of W.H. Auden poems. Anyway, at various points in my life, I've tried to become, you know, a reader of poetry and an understander of poems, but it's always been really difficult for me. As a matter of fact, I've always felt a little bit like Rodney Dangerfield in Back to School.
Go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rage at close of day. Rage against the dying of the light.
With the exception being that Dangerfield does a pretty good job of reading the Dylan Thomas poem he reads here out loud. And I've always even struggled with the cadence and how to deal with punctuation, line breaks in poems. It's just been something that's just never really been me. I oftentimes or sometimes read poems and I enjoy specific poems, but oftentimes I find that I don't think about poems until, you know, I see them read in movies. This tag is really uncomfortable for me, but I'm going to try to go through the different prompts in the tag and give answers in part. So maybe I can go back and look at this in a year and say, look how much about poetry I've learned and look how many other poets I've read and, you know, feel like I've had some kind of growth. So question number 1 from the tag was, do you read and write poetry, or do you just read it? And then Adrian made what I think is a fairly good statement, that if you don't read it, you're probably not really writing it. So my answer to, do I read poetry? Sometimes. Do I write poetry? Sometimes. I do enjoy the creative process of writing. I do like it. Sometimes an idea or sometimes a mental image will come up and I just want to write it down. I just want to play with that idea and that image. And so I do sometimes write poetry. Bad poetry, I'm sure, but I do sometimes do so, and sometimes I read it. Question number 2 is, who's your favorite poet? And my favorite poet is Dylan Thomas. I did the badass poetry tag, and I think I answered this question. My favorite poem, then, is a poem by Dylan Thomas called Death Be Not Proud. So that's the answer to question number 2. That's the answer to question number 3. Question number 4 was, we could ask one question of your favorite poet. What would it be? My favorite poet is Dylan Thomas, and you may or may not know that he essentially drank himself to death, and now that I'm saying this out loud, I feel a little guilty about my question. My question for Dylan Thomas would be, you know, what's the best pub in Wales, or maybe more specifically in Cardiff, or in New York, or in London, just to get his idea about, you know, where the best place to go to have a pint or to, you know, have a whiskey would be in those towns. I would be afraid to engage Dylan Thomas about his poetry because, as I've said, I'm fairly ignorant on the subject. My favorite poem to read out loud is a poem, again, that I mentioned in my badass poetry tag. by Robert Burns. Robert Burns is another poet that I like a lot, and it's called Scotsmen Who Have With. And one of the things I like about Burns is that his attempt to write in the Scottish dialect. And I like that poem a lot, and it's a fun poem to read out loud. It has a really kind of martial air to it. I think it's been made into a song, which has some patriotic meaning in Scotland. My Mount Rushmore of poets. Again, I feel incredibly unqualified to decide who gets to be on the Mount Rushmore of poetry, but it's a question of the tag, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. So my Mount Rushmore would be Shakespeare, Dickinson, Whitman, and then I would probably go ahead and put Dylan Thomas on there. He is, after all, my favorite poet. It would seem odd for him to be my favorite and not for him to have him on my own personal Mount Rushmore of poetry. Number 7 is my favorite poetry collection, and my favorite poetry collection is actually this old, beat-up, used copy of The Contemporary American Poets, which was a paperback published quite some time ago, and it's my favorite because I just found it. I was talking to Kelly about reading more poetry and cooperating maybe on Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, and maybe cooperating on some kind of poetry project, and I mentioned I didn't have an anthology of American poets. And then I remembered that in graduate school I'd done a research paper about beatniks, and I'd come across this book which had a few of the beatnik poets in it, and when I went to look for it, lo and behold, there it is on my shelves. And since it's something I think I'm going to need and something I'm relieved to have, I'm for right now going to call that my favorite anthology of poems. Question number 8 was rhyming, yes or no. My answer is why not. I will admit that in modern terms, that it seems somewhat out of place to me a little bit when you read modern poetry, modern American poetry, and this again is probably an attitude born from ignorance, but if it's not done incredibly well now, I think given the context in which modern readers would be looking at it, if it's not done incredibly well now, it almost feels a little juvenile. Maybe this is Shel Silverstein's fault, maybe this is Dr. Seuss's fault, maybe this is W.H. Auden's fault, or Ogden Nash's fault. But it just seems to be like it has this almost, for me, and again, someone who's not really an expert on poetry, to me it has this kind of almost air of silliness or humor, and it's harder to take it seriously, which I think is a shame. I do think that real poets trying to create serious poetry could include rhyme and could do it so well that I would feel completely differently. But it's just as a general gut reaction, I would say, yes in older poetry, and I have my doubts in more modern poetry. Prompt number 9 was, what's your favorite poetic form? So I have no idea. What I do know, thanks to watching one of Alan's videos and some of Alan's responses to my Badass Poetry tag, was that the Dylan Thomas poem, Death Be Not Proud, I believe is called a villanelle. So since it's my favorite poem, I'm going to call that my favorite poetic form, the villanelle. And now, I feel like a completely pretentious wanker for acting like I know what the hell that is. And I'll be honest with you, I don't. I just know, or I think I know, that my favorite poem is that form of poem. Let's see, humor in poetry, sure, why not? I like Ogden Nash's, sometimes his little 4-line poems I find kind of funny and amusing, so I have no problem with that, and I think humor in poetry has a place. I do think it can be kind of a difficult thing to work into poetry. And then the 11th prompt, or the 11th question in the tag, was elements that make a good poem. So what I would say is that in general, I think the poems that I like are ones that use what I'm just going to call everyday language, that they're not going for the kind of words where I'm going to have to look them up in the dictionary to make sure I know their meaning. This doesn't mean they have to be completely simple words. They just have to be words that are in that kind of, in the vocabulary of fairly well-read people with a decent vocabulary. And I like it when that kind of everyday language can be used in a musical way, almost in a kind of rhythmic way. I like it when everyday language can be made more beautiful, and when there is precision in the use of language in poetry to create the exact image, I think, that the author and the poet is going for, and the exact emotional response that they're trying to provoke. That, to me, is what makes a good poem. Anyway, there it is. There's my response to the PoetryTube Newbie Tag. Thank you, Alan, for tagging me, and thank you to Adrian and Dalton at Strip Coverlet for creating this tag. It was more fun than I thought it was going to be, and I don't feel quite as much of a fraud as I thought I would when I started. Anyway, let me know what you think about my video and what I mentioned in the comments section, and as always, thank you for watching.